In my last video, where I covered 10 disturbing movies, one of which was Megan is Missing and which I ranked at number 10, I indicated that I had almost too much to say about that film, and that I had decided to make an entirely separate video. What did I have to say about that movie that required so much space? Well, of all the disturbing movies I have ever seen, a lot of which feature many horrific, taboo, eviscerating scenes, Megan is Missing left me feeling the most dirty, even complicit, and I felt that movie was the most exploitative. And even in the comments, Megan is Missing was repeatedly identified as one that went too far. On the wider internet, some opinions about the movie highlight how offensive they felt it was. But then, there was also a large group of commenters who thought that Megan is Missing wasn't scary or disturbing at all, just bad and stupid. Overall though, there seemed to be interest in a follow-up on Megan is Missing, but some strongly rejected even the idea of giving the movie any kind of spotlight. I hope you find this as puzzling as I do. Truly, I haven't been able to stop thinking about Megan is Missing's complete failure. Obviously, there is subjectivity here. Some things are more disturbing to some people than to others, but I think there's a deeper layer. A lot of what is said about Megan is Missing amounts to little more than that it's just gross and shocking, but there's more to it than that. Megan is Missing has a structure that amplifies its exploitative feeling, and makes its already gross subject matter even more uncomfortable. So my intention today is to analyze Megan is Missing and show, beyond just being gross, why it causes people, myself included, to feel so strongly about it, and to call it words like exploitative. And yeah, I think Megan is Missing is gross over and above the mere fact of what it portrays. Yes, the subject matter is bad, really bad. But it's how the movie portrays it that makes it truly detestable, and what causes this strong reaction from the viewership. I want to peer behind the curtain, to understand the source of the grossness that many just don't pick up on, and others are unable to verbalize. Additionally, the director has said that the movie is a PSA, or public service announcement, about predators lurking online. But many people, once again including myself, found the movie to be too off-putting and predatory rather than educational. Again, why is this? How did Megan is Missing fail so badly in its attempt to be an educational PSA? For those who don't know, Megan is Missing was released in 2011 and was directed by Michael Goy. It follows two 14-year-old girls, Megan and Amy, as they are manipulated and eventually captured by an online predator. I'll give more plot details later, but for now, overall, I want to look at how Megan is Missing's construction causes a misallocation of empathy, and thus why it fails at what it sets out to do. In the course of answering this question, we will touch on these other questions of film analysis and media literacy. How can a movie portray extreme content while remaining tasteful, and not feel too exploitative? How can it separate the viewer from the violence it depicts? How can a movie that victimizes its characters maintain an empathetic connection to them? It's important to investigate why the movie fails in all of these regards, so that future PSA-type films can be more effective. In all though, basically I intend to dissect why this movie feels so unbelievably wrong and tasteless over and above the obvious fact of what it depicts, learn some lessons from it, and hopefully we can stop talking about it forever after that. So this isn't a moral analysis of Megan is Missing, or a review. If you want a review, check my last video. No, it's an analysis of the aesthetic form of the movie, and how that form turns the audience into unwilling participants, though I will occasionally reference a feeling of morality because of the PSA angle. To further elucidate my arguments, I will look at a few other films as case studies in how movies can be tasteful and direct empathy and position the audience, while recognizing those terms are subjective. The main counterexample I will be using is Funny Games from 2007. Now, if you're familiar with both of these movies, you might question why I don't use something more similar in subject matter, and I understand this concern, but my focus here is again not on the subject matter itself, it's the portrayal and structure. Funny Games here is used as a counterpoint in form, not in quality or due to any similarity in content. Funny Games works so well because it directly plays with POV and audience involvement, and helps to keep the discussion above the mere fact of what these movies portray, because Funny Games doesn't feature the same kinds of violence. Basically, comparing Megan is Missing to Funny Games helps to keep the discussion more general because they aren't about the same thing, and it adds a lot of content to think about. And with that said, I am going to issue a content warning here. Megan is Missing portrays fictional sexual assaults, and I will be discussing them, though I will not go into graphic details, nor will I show any graphic clips or stills. Everything will be kept high level. I have tried my hardest to make this script respectful and measured, especially due to Megan is Missing's reputation, but if this topic is too much for you, I would encourage clicking away now. Your mental health and well-being comes first. I'll reference this again at the end of the video, but I will list some resources in the description and a pinned comment that may be helpful, because obviously these movies deal with subject matter that is relevant to the real world and real victims. Additionally, while this video will be mostly film analysis and I'm probably worrying too much, just to be safe, the script was reviewed by a CSA survivor who asked to remain anonymous, but consented to be referenced here. Her notes were very helpful in ensuring my language stays careful and that the analysis stays focused on aesthetics. Of course, she does not claim to speak for all survivors, her perspective just informed my wording and added to the video's argument. Also, I'll be drawing on Professor Carol J. Clover's book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, with a citation where relevant, but my framework and analysis is mostly influenced by her rather than any kind of direct application. For those familiar, there is definitely some overlap between what I say and what she says, but I diverge heavily as well. I say this to make sure the viewer is aware that this video is intended to be analytical rather than sensational. I will also say that if you're interested in film theory and horror movies, Men, Women, and Chainsaws is a fantastic place to start. Here is how the video will be organized, because I believe that will help in understanding everything. Though at the end of the day, everything I say will be quite simple. First, I'll give a very brief overview of the plots of Megan is Missing and Funny Games. Then I will outline a simple theoretical lens through which we can analyze Megan is Missing and the other movies. After that, I will look at the structure of Megan is Missing, its perspectives, construction, and features, and I will try to understand what the choices of structure in Megan is Missing do to the audience using that theoretical lens. Following this, I will go somewhat outside the movie itself and analyze the PSA angle, and look more closely at Funny Games. Finally, we will look at some other counterexamples. One last thing, as I go through these arguments and aspects of the movies, you might notice that one thing I say doesn't work in Megan is Missing might be utilized quite well in a different movie. None of what I will be highlighting specifically in isolation is bad. Megan is Missing isn't a uniquely exploitative movie because of any one aspect or other. It's a very unique aggregation of many different factors. Other movies might do one or even many things that Megan is Missing also does, and still not feel so uncomfortable. This video's arguments are not meant to be considered in isolation. They should be considered holistically. Every piece of information builds the entire argumentative scheme. With that said, let's get into the plots. As I said above, Megan is Missing follows two 14-year-old friends, Megan and Amy. They are very different. Megan is popular and likes to party and do drugs and whatnot, and Amy is unpopular and doesn't engage in the same behaviors, which earns Amy the ire of Megan's popular friends. Against those friends' wishes, Megan takes Amy to a party where they are harassed by some belligerent, creepy guys. We then learn soon after that Megan has been preyed upon by a lot of older men in the past. Then, Megan's friend Lexi connects Megan with someone named Josh, who is apparently a 17-year-old boy. They video chat, but Josh's camera is broken. Josh is able to win her trust despite this, and despite standing her up at a party, and eventually Megan introduces Amy to Josh, briefly. Soon after this, Josh convinces Megan to meet up with him. Megan goes missing while away for this meetup, and eventually some very low-quality security footage is discovered, which shows Megan being grabbed by some older-looking man. Amy talks to Josh online, asking if he's seen Megan, but he claims he hasn't. After more searching and getting harassed by Megan's friends, Amy confronts Josh again, and Josh begins to insult her and threaten her when he realizes that she likely suspects him. Then, some unsavory and very graphic images of Megan are released online, confirming that she was taken by an online predator. Soon after this, Amy is also taken by some man. We see in recorded footage, presumably from Josh, that Amy is being kept in a dungeon. The man assaults her and reveals that he killed Megan, forcing Amy to get inside a barrel with Megan's corpse. Then he buries the barrel, with Amy still alive inside, trapped with Megan's corpse, which ends the film. Funny Games follows affluent couple George and Anne, along with their son Georgie, as they travel to their lake house. They have frequent and increasingly strained encounters with two men, Paul and Peter. Eventually, Paul and Peter drop their facades, kind of, and reveal their intentions to torment and kill the family. They do this through mean-spirited bets and games. Long story short, they end up killing Georgie, and let George and Anne think they left, before returning and continuing the games. Anne manages to kill Peter, but Paul, who has repeatedly broken the fourth wall throughout the movie, literally rewinds the film to before Peter's death, and changes it to where Peter survives. They then kill Anne and George and move on to another family. These are very rough plot descriptions of the movies, but they should give you a basic idea of what we're dealing with here. Now we can move to the way we will analyze Megan is Missing and the other films. For the purpose of this analysis, I'm going to posit a very simple model through which we can view these movies. We can think of Megan is Missing and the others as having a victim role, a predatory role, and a spectator role. At first glance, Megan is Missing fills these roles by having Megan and Amy as the victims, Josh and the creepy dudes in the beginning as the predators, and the audience as the spectators. Now, you may question how useful these distinctions are. Many movies collapse victim and predator, for instance, like a Serbian film does with Miłosz. Megan is Missing strictly upholds the victim-predator binary, but how it collapses the predator-spectator binary is exactly what I will be focusing on. I will try to show that through the very construction of the movie, Megan is Missing frequently collapses the spectator-predator roles into one, which makes the movie feel less like a PSA and more like a voyeuristic, gross experience. Normally, these roles might be all there is, but because Megan is Missing is a found footage film, we can question who assembled the footage. Megan is Missing explicitly tells us that the footage we see has been gathered and collected, and that we are watching a sort of documentary. So we can think about a fourth role of movie maker, or documentarian, or editor. This fourth role allows us to critique the PSA purpose without straying too far from the movie itself. Now that we have our tool of analysis briefly outlined, let's look at how the movie is constructed and what it contains. I'll basically list out the aspects I want to highlight with a bit of discussion and context, and then analyze the effect that choice of structure has on the viewer by analyzing it through the above theoretical lens. As a preview, I argue here that by the very structure of the movie, Megan is Missing makes the audience feel stained by the exploitation depicted, and doesn't do enough to separate the audience from the violence. In fact, it seems to try and push us as close as possible to it, even making the audience into the predators of the movie. And to be very, very clear, I don't intend this section to be a trash fest on Megan is Missing. While I don't like the movie, none of the individual things I'll say are necessarily bad in and of themselves. My goal is purely to explain how and why Megan is Missing's choices of structure make the audience feel gross over and above the content that it features. And all of the following should, once again, be considered holistically. 1. Megan is Missing is a found footage movie. But it is uniquely found footage in that it is partially a webcam movie as well. The main bulk of Megan is Missing is recorded either from Megan and Amy's webcams, which seem to be always recording no matter what Megan and Amy are doing, or from a handheld camera, mostly utilized by the predatory forces within the movie. Some recordings are also added in by the fourth movie maker role, like TV segments of the police investigation. Most of the footage here is just teenage chit-chat, but I want to note two things. First, there are two instances of SA captured on the handheld camera, one of which has a very, very contrived and nonsensical reason for being accessible to the movie maker. The second is that some of what we see, including the aforementioned contrived SA scene, is, in the movie's world, especially despicable and illegal content that would otherwise only be seen by predators and nobody else, save for the investigating police. As the script reviewer noted, when the movie includes material which is explicitly framed for predatory consumption within the movie, this infects and contaminates the spectator role in its essence. Now, normally, relegating the audience to the spectator role is more than enough to prevent the exploitative feel and properly direct empathy. Our natural inclination is to not feel like we are participating in the movie's violence, though some types of movies can break this, like a horror comedy making us root for a slasher, for example. Megan is missing when it shows us the illegal content that was explicitly produced for other online predators by Josh immediately places the spectator role purely in the predatory category. Those elements are only made for exploitative use, and when the audience is shown the fictional illegal content, they no longer feel like they are just watching some movie passively. Basically, when Megan is missing shows the audience material only made for predators, the spectator is made into a predator. And when I say the spectator is made into a predator, this does not reflect the judgments or morality of the viewer or anything like that. It's about what the camera is aligned with and how the editing makes us feel. It's a structural identification which causes disgust and a feeling of grossness, by collapsing the distance between the audience and the predatory villains. So not only is the illegal content that Megan is missing shows us extremely gross and disturbing, we feel even grosser because we are suddenly structurally aligned with predators who consume such content. Secondly, we can question the entire found footage aspect of the movie when the film's internal logic is broken to show us some of the most gruesome scenes. For one, as I mentioned, the webcams appear to always be recording. This gives a feeling of intrusion, like we hacked their webcams. It's as if we are voyeuristically peering into private moments between the characters that we really shouldn't have access to, again giving the normally empathetically aligned role of spectator a predatory vibe. And even more so, there is the issue of the final segment, comprising Amy's imprisonment, assault, and death. Already, this makes us question the movie maker role for including this in a supposed documentary, but it's worse than that. The only way in-universe that the documentarians have access to the footage of Amy's last days is because Josh, inexplicably, returned the camera with all the footage of his crimes to where he abducted Amy in the first place, rather than keeping this incriminating evidence to himself and his creepy associates. This, on the face of it, makes absolutely no sense, and even outside of the analytical lens, just really makes one question its inclusion. The main point, though, is that because the premise of the scene's inclusion is completely implausible, suddenly the realism that the movie uses as a shield drops away, and we are just left with horrific voyeurism. The movie breaks and stretches its own rules to show us the worst stuff, which makes the spectator question why they are even watching the movie, because the realism that the PSA motive requires isn't there, and what's left is just purposeless exploitation. And when a spectator is watching purposeless exploitation, they just feel like a predator. 2. By the very nature of the movie, nearly every time the villains and predators see the girls, the viewer sees them in the exact same fashion. When Megan and Josh are chatting, for example, we see Megan in the same way Josh does, through the webcam. When the predator is in the scene and interacts with the girls, we see the girls through predatory eyes, because the predators are using the same devices to view the girls that record the footage we are seeing. The effect of this is clear enough. It completely collapses the spectator and predator distinction. The audience is made to feel complicit in the crimes and made to identify with the villain because they are literally seeing everything through predatory eyes, including the horrific scenes. The movie makes the audience view the exploitation in the same way that the exploiter does. Now, a lot of objections probably just occurred to you, but hold off as I analyze the antagonist, Josh. 3. Megan is Missing's villain, only ever identified as Josh, is a mostly faceless, minimally embodied antagonist. We are shown a supposed picture of him first, where he appears like a young, attractive surfer dude, but this is almost certainly a fake picture used to catfish the girls. We further see him or an accomplice in some very grainy video, but it's not enough to truly get a sense for who he is or what he looks like. We hear his voice in some scenes as he manipulates Amy and Megan, and we see his legs and arms in some of the final bits of footage. So yes, assuming the force behind Josh is a single individual, he definitely exists and has something of a physical presence and personality, given that we see parts of his body and hear his voice, but Josh is not a robust individual presence. We hear his words, but we don't see him say them or know his thoughts. We see his arms and legs, but his clothing appears nondescript, and we don't get a good look at his face. Josh is an empty character. His villainous presence is just that, a kind of vague presence. One might contrast this with Michael Myers. While Michael Myers is explicitly stated to be a personality-lacking vessel of pure evil, who literally for the most part refrains from showing his face, Michael Myers still feels like a robust individual villain because his physical embodiment is always identifiable individually. While we sometimes get POV shots from him as he stalks his victims, we are always able to separate ourselves from what he does because Michael Myers is his own unique, individualized, embodied presence. We see his face, sometimes, his entire body, we know his tactics, and we know the emptiness of his mind. Despite how lacking in content Michael Myers is, there is enough there to make sure that the spectator-predator distinction doesn't disappear. Josh is just some guy with no defined characteristics, and we know nothing about him, and his presence doesn't feel real outside of what he does to the girls, whereas a more traditional villain might feel like a presence in and of themselves. So Josh is a kind of empty presence, and this is what makes Megan is Missing feel so uniquely gross in an ocean of media in which we inhabit the villain's POV. Other works of art, particularly transgressive novels like Notes from Underground or Full Brutal for an extreme horror example, are able to feature a predatory POV without feeling overly exploitative or fostering too much identification with the villain by employing techniques like internal contradiction, madness, or adding hints of comedy. By doing so, the works of art make it clear that they aren't relishing what the protagonist does, despite the protagonist relishing their crimes, because their mind or inner world is simply too wrong or different to truly inhabit. Despite knowing their thoughts, we don't share in their thoughts. And even in the case of a straightforwardly written predatory protagonist not employing those above techniques, simply the fact that they are well defined can be enough to keep us out of that predatory role, because it's already filled by a robust presence. I say this to show that one can have a predatory POV without making the audience inhabit the predatory role, keeping them mostly in the spectator category. The POV isn't the problem at all. I have loved a lot of works written from a villainous or grotesque perspective. The problem is whether or not the work of art gives the audience the tools to remain separate from the violent atrocities depicted. Megan is Missing makes the audience inhabit the predatory role, above just following a predatory POV. I already mentioned the fact that the audience always views the girls in the same exact way that the predators view them, but Josh, as an empty villain, doesn't give us much to separate ourselves from. We don't know what he thinks or feels, we don't know how he looks, we have nothing to separate ourselves from because he barely exists. We have nobody to feel disgust at, because Josh is nobody. He is underdefined on screen, so in the end, the only real defined person inhabiting the predator role is the viewer. If we can't truly revile Josh, if our disgust has nowhere to land, we just end up reviling ourselves. Now, Josh's facelessness is almost certainly designed to enhance the PSA aspect, and I will return to why the PSA aspect fails, so stay tuned. 4. One aspect that I will mention but won't spend too much time on is the general sexualizing nature of the movie. This is the part that gets talked about most online and is the most clearly discomfort-creating aspect. The leering camera angles, the overly sexualized dialogue, the actors being around 17 at time of filming, the extremely lengthy and voyeuristic shots, the victim-blamey feeling, the intimate claustrophobic nature, etc. All of these, of course, will make Megan is Missing an extremely hard watch, and given that the movie forces the audience into this predatory villainous role, I think it is clear to see how all of these problems are exacerbated. 5. Finally, Megan is Missing doesn't feature a lot of the effects of the violence and horror it portrays. There are scenes of Amy's parents exhibiting some grief after her disappearance. Amy and Megan's friends are definitely sad over Megan's disappearance, and the movie features television segments of the investigation, but the primary focus of the movie is merely on the manipulation, violence, and exploitation itself, not the effect it has on the characters and their families. Even the television segments of the investigation often feature tongue-in-cheek satirical elements rather than genuine grief. Basically, the movie seems to have a very different aim than generating empathy. But to be clear, the viewer definitely has empathy for Megan and Amy. That is without a doubt. I'm not trying to say that the viewer feels nothing for them. but the way the movie directs that empathy is problematic. For example, after Megan is captured by Josh, she completely disappears from the movie. She is exploited and manipulated, and then she is gone, only to reappear briefly as a corpse for a jump scare, and in the illegal content online. Rather than keeping her in the movie somehow to allow the audience to empathize with her, or just giving her scenes where she isn't objectified, she is relegated to an object purely for exploitative and shock value. It's not that we don't feel for her, of course we do. It's that the movie seemingly limits our opportunities to do so. Because the movie is more focused on merely portraying the violence and chooses to be subtly satirical in the news segments, and because it doesn't give enough focus on the impact of the movie's events, Megan is Missing forgoes its one opportunity to separate us from the predatory role and properly direct empathy. If it had put a greater emphasis on community and family empathy and sympathy, the audience might have been able to cognitively separate ourselves from the predatory role. But Megan is Missing doesn't do this, so all of the above effects are left without any level of empathetic counterbalance. Imagine if, instead of the last purely torturous third of the movie, we saw Amy's parents grieving, petitioning the police, searching, and maybe they even found some type of organization to combat child predation in honor of Amy. Suddenly, the movie is less about exploitation and more about empathy and solving a horrific problem. There's counterbalance to the victim's exploitation. Additionally, try to think about how a predator might view the events of the movie, and what they would focus on. They likely wouldn't care about the effects of the violence, they would only care about the violence and predation and exploitation themselves, and not care at all about how it affects the victim, their family, and their community, save for maybe a bit of relishing their pain. By neglecting to show those things in sufficient empathetic detail, Megan is Missing ends up feeling predatory merely by construction because it focuses purely on predation itself. To make this point explicit, I will turn to Professor Carol J. Clover's work, specifically where she is investigating rape revenge movies, which is a genre with similar content to Megan is Missing, featuring movies like Miss 45 from 1981 and Revenge from 2017. I know that this is content specific, so just try to keep in mind that the overall focus is on the aesthetic form, but I think these points are useful. In the following quote, she is analyzing how these movies don't feel as exploitative as one might assume because of how they generate empathy. The only way to account for the spectator's engagement is to assume his engagement with the rape-avenging woman. Every narrative and cinematic device is deployed to draw us into her perception. Megan is Missing is the opposite of what Professor Clover says. Every narrative and cinematic device in Megan is Missing is deployed to make us aligned with the predator and to draw us into their perception rather than the victim's. And even plot-wise, Megan is Missing is just a rape revenge movie without the revenge. For Clover, the revenge aspect of these movies realigns their narratives morally, but Megan is Missing denies us that. In fact, it is exploitation and nothing else. It hurts Megan and Amy, and then ends. Their suffering was just purposeless and senseless, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself to explore in a movie, as we'll see with Funny Games, but I think it goes without saying what pure exploitation feels like to the audience when they are shoved into the predatory role. As another brief example, just to hammer this part of the analysis home, one can think of the movie Irreversible from 2002, which also features similar content. Irreversible is told backwards, in reverse chronological order. Here is Roger Ebert on what this structural choice does. The fact is, the reverse chronology makes Irreversible a film that structurally argues against rape and violence, while ordinary chronology would lead us down a seductive narrative path toward a shocking exploitative payoff. What else could describe Megan is Missing other than what Ebert called a seductive narrative path toward a shocking exploitative payoff? Megan is Missing sexualizes its characters, brutalizes them, and then ends, and we view it all through the predator's lens. Irreversible builds with aftermath to the event and then recenters itself on the victim's humanity, while also featuring a defined, embodied, and overwhelmingly disgusting villain. In this way, Megan is Missing just feels extraordinarily mean-spirited to its victimized characters. It structurally denies them the empathy they deserve, and there is nothing to take the predatory weight off of the audience. There is no respite, no aftermath, no hope, and absolutely no respect, just abuse. In all, the movie does everything it can, whether intentionally or not, to shove the predatory burden onto the spectatorial role, and further invites one to question the movie maker as well for the overtly predatory inclusions. With this analysis, I hope to have shown that Megan is Missing, through its content and construction, forces the audience to take on a predatory role, and this, combined with the overtly taboo sexual nature of the film, leaves us feeling immensely stained and gross. And with no robust villainous presence for us to blame, we are forced to blame ourselves just for watching, and the director for making such a movie. Speaking of the director, we can now turn to the PSA problem. As I said before, Megan is Missing is often billed as a kind of PSA about online predation. I think nearly everyone can agree that, in isolation, this is an admirable goal. But this goal is undercut at nearly every turn because the movie punishes us for even watching it by continually routing us through the predatory lens. What kind of message does it send to the viewers when they think that it's a PSA, watch it, and then find themselves unbelievably disgusted with themselves because they've seemingly been blamed and condemned for the movie's violence? This is just a failure to achieve the effect you wanted, and we can see that empirically with how many people denounce the movie as exploitative rather than educational. And I can't even imagine what this must be like for survivors of the sort of trauma that Megan is Missing depicts, though of course I don't want to speak for them. Rather than supplying an empathetic, tasteful depiction of a real problem, the movie, I assume, will end up forcing victims in the audience to identify with the predators because of how it was made, and then just witness further victimization. And a cursory search online will show that this has, unfortunately, borne out in reality. There are two other reasons why Megan is Missing's PSA nature is undercut, and they are related to how exactly director Michael Goy conceptualized the movie. He claimed that he wanted to depict a brutally hopeless and realistic scenario. Now, I've already mentioned how an increased focus on community effort and activism might have helped make the movie feel less exploitative, and notice that this is still possible by Goy's realist intentions. Realism itself isn't a warrant for purposeless exploitation, because it's a choice to exclude empathetic responses. Similarly, Megan is Missing doesn't really even depict a realistic scenario, as has been noted online. One of the organizations I will plug later, Thorn, has an interesting breakdown on how this kind of exploitation actually occurs, and it's generally not the kind of situation Megan is Missing depicts. Basically, Megan is Missing's purported realism is not a great reason, because it isn't even realistic, and omits certain aspects that might have mitigated the traumatizing feeling. Megan is Missing, I would contend, feels so uniquely dirty and gross because it claims to have a moral purpose and message, but the exact opposite is conveyed to the audience. In fact, this is where the reviewer noted that when a PSA routes the viewers through the predatory gaze, it actually risks rewarding the predatory impulse rather than warning against it. Now, this is a good place to address a suggestion I received in the last video on disturbing movies. A few people heard my preliminary thoughts on Megan is Missing's exploitativeness and thought that maybe the director was actually trying to make the viewers feel bad, akin to Funny Games, where the audience is condemned for even watching the movie. It's here that I will digress on Funny Games for a bit and analyze what it does to position the audience. As I said in the beginning, Funny Games follows an affluent family as they are tormented and killed by two young men, Paul and Peter, with Paul repeatedly breaking the fourth wall. How does he break the fourth wall? Well, he glances at the audience at times when something shocking occurs, often with a smirk. It's like Bugs Bunny looking at the audience and saying, "Isn't this great? It's what you wanted, right?"
Am I a stinker?
In fact, Paul literally turns to the audience at certain points and tells them exactly this, that we wanted this to happen. We want plot and drama. Paul, by his awareness of his status as a fictional character, positions himself as the audience's agent within the movie. He sees himself as guaranteeing that the movie goes the way the audience wants it to, albeit in a spiteful way. As he says these lines to the audience, or looks at the camera, he indicts us. It's almost maliciously compliant with the audience's desire to watch a movie because Paul makes us aware that ultimately we just wanted to watch people get tortured and killed and it's our fault. The character's suffering finds meaning in our voyeuristic enjoyment, and he is happy to tell us that. When things go south for Paul and Peter, through Anne's killing of Peter with a shotgun, Paul just laughs, grabs a remote, and rewinds the movie that he's in, taking us back to before Anne could disrupt the movie's sadistic events. Such a premature death would have ruined the audience's experience by ending it too early. He fulfills our sadistic wish for a longer cruelty. This condemnation of the spectators and the audience was the director's stated goal. He wanted to make a movie that was basically pointless except for the violence, and make the audience question why they want to watch such a thing. So Funny Games makes the viewers feel gross and bad, just like Megan is Missing does. But Funny Games isn't a PSA about a real-world problem, and its goal is exactly in line with what it actually does. And we can also look further at Funny Games using our threefold distinction and compare it to Megan is Missing's aspects from above. It's clear that Anne, George, and Georgie are the victims, Paul and Peter are the villains, and we are still the audience or spectators. Now, Funny Games isn't a found footage movie. Because it isn't found footage, Funny Games doesn't share the above constraints and problems that Megan is Missing does. There's no realism or internal logic that Funny Games has to adhere to. In fact, Funny Games deliberately flouts its own movie logic by having Paul nonsensically rewind the movie. When Megan is Missing breaks its own rules to show us gross stuff, it feels wrong and doesn't work. But Funny Games' rules are meant to be broken. We also never directly share in the POV of Paul and Peter, because the camera is comfortably third person. But as I said above, Paul's frequent fourth wall breaks structurally align the audience with the villains. He positions himself as our agent within the world, and these wall breaks reinforce that kinship. So on the face of it, Funny Games and Megan is Missing are somewhat similar in this regard, but the key distinction is that Funny Games' camera work rarely forgoes a single opportunity to direct empathy at the family. These fourth wall breaks give the spectatorial audience a villainous stain, but the movie never abandons empathy for the victims. We are given many long shots of unmitigated anguish and pain from the family as they suffer and grieve. As a third-person spectator, we will naturally gravitate to identifying with the victims. And these brutal episodes draw us further and further in. A key example scene is right after Georgie's death. What follows is a minutes-long static shot of the room as Anne and George struggle to regain their composure without Paul and Peter anywhere near. We are given enough breathing room from the predatory role to properly realign with the victims and feel their pain. And when Paul keeps reminding us that this suffering is our fault because it's only happening since we wanted to watch a brutal movie, we just feel guilty and bad for the characters. So yeah, while Funny Games, like Megan is Missing, sometimes aligns the spectators with the predators, it also forces a guilty identification with the victim's suffering. Megan is Missing feels predatory and voyeuristic, but Funny Games feels like you're witnessing something horrific as a result of your own choices, almost out of respect for the victims. It reminds me of the first episode of Game of Thrones, where Ned Stark forces his boys to watch him carry out an execution. They say,
"The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword."
And while we don't directly swing the sword on the family, we at least witness the suffering we cause. Additionally, Funny Games never allows the spectators to directly take on the predatory role. Peter and Paul are both embodied, well-defined characters. We blame ourselves, but we also blame them, unlike when we couldn't blame Josh, who had a minimal physical individual presence. So there are many ways in which Funny Games is able to make the audience feel bad, but not feel too exploitative or terrible like Megan is Missing does. Now that we've looked at Funny Games in depth, we can return to the suggestion that the director of Megan is Missing was trying to condemn the audience, just like Funny Games does. Both movies clearly invite guilt from the audience and make us partially identify with the villains. For Funny Games, this is directly in line with the director's stated goal, but not in the case of Megan is Missing. Imagine if Michael Goy was trying to similarly condemn the audience while still having the PSA motive. In that case, I would honestly contend that this aesthetic intention to condemn the audience leads to a moral failure, rather than a moral intention, the PSA, that happens to end up in aesthetic failure, in the case that the director just accidentally made a really gross movie. It's a moral failure because it goes against the PSA motive and can only be harmful to real victims watching. You want to educate the audience and raise awareness, but the movie's predatory framing will likely have the opposite effect, as can be clearly seen online where people think the movie shouldn't even be discussed. Though I should say, there were a few comments on my last video that said the PSA worked for them, so it's not all black and white. Either way, in this movie's case, because of the stated PSA intention and the taboo subject matter, condemnation and education are mutually exclusive aims, because the movie can't be a PSA without also hurting survivors if it tries to condemn them. And also, what is the movie even condemning us for? Watching a movie that apparently has good intentions? It doesn't make sense. Given the director's own words, however, I tend to think this is not true. I genuinely think that Michael Goy did not intend to condemn the audience. He even issues warnings about viewership that make me think he doesn't truly want to traumatize the audience, and rather wants to scare them about a real problem. Though, of course, I could be totally wrong on this, and if anybody knows more about Michael Goy, please share that information in the comments. We've discussed how and why Megan is Missing fails to be a tasteful depiction of extreme violence, and how Funny Games, in my opinion, deftly evades this problem. I'd like to take this time now to look at a few more disturbing movies, namely the ones I covered in my last video, and see how they sidestep the problem of the exploitative feeling, at least more than Megan is Missing does, because some movies are better or worse at situating the audience in a more empathetic and less predatory vantage point. A Serbian film has been called the most disgusting movie of all time, and is literally labeled an exploitation film. I am only referencing the cut version since I have not seen the uncut one, and from what I've heard, that one is far less tasteful. Even still, a Serbian film is able to separate the audience from its violence by having our lead character, who participates in the victimization of the other characters, be a victim himself. The movie at once collapses the predator-victim distinction with Miłosz and has an even greater predator with Vukmir. We hate what's happening to Miłosz because we like him, and we hate what he does to the other characters because we like them, and because Miłosz is made to do those things completely against his will. The entire movie's theme is about exploitation, and nothing in the uncut version of the movie, in my opinion, goes against this theme, unlike with Megan is Missing's failure to be a PSA. The Human Centipede 2 is probably the worst example other than Megan is Missing, in my opinion, but even it is able to feel less horrible than that movie. For one, The Human Centipede 2 is self-aware. As I discussed in the last video, this movie feels like it's saying, you guys wanted this, and I'm giving you what you wanted, but you should be careful what you wish for. The movie condemns the audience, like Funny Games, and its condemnation is consistent with what it portrays. The Human Centipede 2 isn't trying to be a PSA about human centipedification, it's a commentary on extreme movies, and the condemnation is earned. Additionally, the antagonistic main character is portrayed as profoundly unstable and cruel and grotesque. He is shown to be completely and utterly depraved, and we are never able to share in the predator role because of how absolutely monstrous and insane he is. The villain role is filled, and it's filled to the absolute brim, leaving us no room for us to feel residual blame for the movie. And finally, The Human Centipede 2 ends on a note that leaves it open as to whether or not the events of the film even happened, and I chose to believe that they didn't, like I'm sure many others do, and I was grateful the movie gave me that choice. I outlined some earlier examples with contradictions and madness in a POV like Full Brutal, so those can also be kept in mind here. Martyrs, while somewhat making Lucy a villain in the beginning, soon refocuses its POV purely around the victims, Lucy included. The movie is basically pure empathy, and the ending solidifies that all the torturing the villains perpetuate is completely meaningless. It's a grim, tragic, sad experience, but not one that feels exploitative because we, the audience, always have our empathy effectively directed at the victim. The Girl Next Door does many of the same things as Martyrs, and also gives us David, a character who, while I think has a flawed execution, nevertheless serves as an empathetic foothold in the movie's sad world. David is one of the only ones who cares about the torture happening to Meg, the movie's victim, and his care allows us to remain fully in the spectator role and not feel so gross, because we are structurally aligned with the goodness in the world, rather than being structurally aligned with the predatory forces. Those are all I want to discuss for now. I think it should be clear how films can avoid making the audience feel the same way that Megan is Missing does. They have to effectively allow us to not take on the predatory role, and this can be accomplished in a variety of ways. So, what can we say about all this? I think, given what we discussed, the difference between tasteful extreme art and exploitative extreme art seems to hinge on how much distance is allowed between the audience and the on-screen violence, and there are plenty of techniques to implement this distance. Megan is Missing completely collapses the distance, and the stated moral purpose of the movie makes that collapsed distance feel even worse, while other movies seemingly do everything they can to restore and maintain the distance. And a PSA, like Megan is Missing, coupled with the subject matter and the potential viewings from real-life victims, should direct empathy very carefully. I don't think movies need to shy away from portraying extreme content, but I think they should do so effectively. And as I said in the introduction and just alluded to, these movies deal with very sensitive topics that in the real world have actual victims. And why put so much effort into how movies can carefully portray extreme situations effectively while not asking a single question about the real life victims of these crimes? It's easy to care too much about pure media consumption without looking outside every now and then. For this reason, I will leave a pinned comment with further reading, resources, and organizations that are working to combat these types of exploitation. All of this video's AdSense revenue will be donated to the charities in the description, and in the case of demonetization, I will just take the hit, and I would encourage anybody with the means to do so to do the same. I wanted to particularly highlight the organization Thorn, which develops technological solutions to prevent the spread of child exploitation online, and the NCMEC, which does similar work on a broader scale. Both of these have high charity ratings and, from what I can tell, do overwhelmingly good work. I've added more resources in the pinned comment, and I encourage anybody to add to that comment if they have other valuable resources to contribute. Okay, that's the end of all that. Thank you for watching patiently and carefully, and if you like thoughtful, careful analysis of media, I would highly recommend subscribing to my YouTube channel. I primarily do videos on philosophy and dark fiction, with some wildcard videos here and there. If you want content on horror, I recently made 2 videos on extreme horror books and disturbing movies, and this, as I mentioned, is actually a sort of follow-up to the disturbing movies video. If you prefer analysis of media, you might be interested in my early Heideggerian analyses, or my philosophical interpretation of Thomas Ligotti's The Red Tower. Either way, any engagement is highly appreciated. Also, I made a Goodreads profile for this YouTube channel, so if you want to add me on there, I'd be happy to add you back. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.